Hello, I'm Bob Wilhelm, and I'm a storyteller. When I graduated with my doctorate in 1976, I was appointed to be an associate professor at Niagara University in upstate New York, and my assignment was a surprising one. In my teaching load, I would teach world religions, something I was not trained for because my work was in religious art, performing art, visual art, and so forth. And so I made an important decision that, as well as teaching the basics about history, doctrine, moral principles of the great religions of the world, I would also use a storytelling approach because I felt that storytelling would get to the heart of the spirituality of a tradition. Now, I taught in the manner that might be called comparative religion, that is, a kind of a secularist approach to religious studies, which asks the instructor to put aside their own personal beliefs and look objectively on each of the great religious traditions, hoping to find many partial truths in each one. And of course, the assumption is that ultimately each presents a partial path to in a search that can not be fulfilled by any religious tradition on its own, any singular tradition. Well, I've long since rejected that. I have found that you need to share stories from other religious traditions. You need to listen to other stories from other religious traditions with passion and with conviction of your own religious faith. So, as a disclosure, I have to tell you I'm a Catholic Christian, more specifically a Byzantine Catholic Christian, which means I follow the spirituality of the Eastern churches. And the stories that I most engaged with were stories from the Western religious tradition, especially the Hasidic stories, as well as the folk tales of Judaism, and the Sufi stories, as well as the folk tales of Islam. And of course, I taught all the required things, all the doctrine, the approach to aesthetics and art, moral decisions, politics, history, and so forth. But it is in this narrative tradition that I found incredible riches. And over the years, I have attempted to use these stories in different settings and have generally met a very negative response. And groups committed to interreligious faith, interfaith dialogue, are far more interested in issuing papers laced with political statements. It's a bit of jockeying for position among the world religious leaders and organizations. They're interested in ideology. They're interested in obscure theology. They're interested in things that I think are not at the heart of the tradition. Now, I have to have a bit of a caveat on this. And the caveat is that I will be looking not at the sacred texts of religious traditions, which raises many, many problems. In other words, not the Quran of Islam, not the Torah, not the Gospels of Christianity. But rather, I'll be looking at the ways that these religious traditions adapted the cultures that they entered into and also the great philosophical wisdom traditions of civilizations. And of course, the unity for all these Western religions, these monotheistic faiths of rooted in the Middle East, is the Hellenistic experience. All three religions are deeply, deeply indebted to the philosophy, the aesthetics, the art, the worldview of the Greeks as passed on to all of the traditions. So we're looking at three Semitic traditions rooted in Semitic experience, but also shaped very powerfully by Indo-European Hellenistic culture. And of course, the local folk tales are always rich with local color and local wisdom. These are the kinds of stories that are shared with all peoples of the world, folk tales, legends, and so forth. And my particular focus with this will be with Judaism, on tales from the Middle East, the traditions of Jewish people in Israel and surrounding countries, and also Hasidic storytelling, because the Hasidim, the reform movement, if you wish to call it that, in Europe in a few centuries ago, really transformed some aspects of Judaism in a very dramatic way, away from secular Judaism, Reform Judaism that we might be more familiar with. So I'm very indebted to that tradition, and because I was also raised in an Eastern European environment, many of my friends were, of course, Ashkenazic Jews, and so that's important in terms of my background. I had little contact with Muslims, good contacts, but little contact as I was growing up and even as I went into graduate school. And so it was a great joy to discover the richness of not only the art and architecture and music. I love classical music from the Middle East, oud music played by Arabs and Persians and Turks, and as well as the visual art, the stunning visual art of Islam. But I'm particularly interested in the rich storytelling traditions that come through the Sufi movement. And the Sufi movement in particular took advantage of contacts with the Hellenistic West in order to develop and deeply influence their own spirituality and the way that they implement Islam. And I don't believe it's possible to be a Sufi without being a Muslim, even though in the West in the past half century there have been many non-Islamic Sufi movements, especially in Western Europe and America, California. But I don't think that those are valid. So the Sufi tradition is a particular way of working with the wisdom and the truth of Islam. All these traditions have this effect on us. Now I have to return to my own background because the stories to match the Sufi stories of Islam and the Hasidic stories of Islam, as well as other story traditions in both those great faiths, is rooted in my Christianity. But my Christianity is a Catholic and Orthodox Christianity rather than a Protestant Christianity. And that means growing up, I grew up comfortably with both church traditions. I'm a Byzantine Catholic, which means I follow all the rituals and the spirituality of the Eastern Orthodox churches. However, my own commitment is to be in communion with the Pope in Rome. So what this means is that there's an incredible collection of folk tales from the Eastern churches, Ethiopia, the Coptic churches of Egypt, the churches of South India, and of course the Middle East and the Balkans, Greek and Russian churches, as well as the traditions of the Roman Church in the West, the Mediterranean cultures of Hispanic traditions and French traditions and Italian traditions and other traditions as well. And I take particular interest in hagiography. I'm an icon painter, and so I paint the stories of people who have been transformed by their religious experience. And some of my favorites are the saints of the Western Church, such as Francis of Assisi. But also the folkloric tradition that interprets the Gospels, many folk tales, humorous folk tales, let's say from places like Italy, that transform the character of Jesus and his disciples, and stories that are profoundly truthful and yet humorous at the same time. And so I gathered all of these traditions in order to bring it to the table, this interreligious table of the monotheistic religions of the West. So I hope you will join me. I've been enjoying doing this over many years. I've used Islamic, Sufi, particularly Sufi stories and Hasidic stories, but other stories from those traditions in my own ways of reflecting on the Christian scriptures, because I believe that the wisdom of these stories can teach me as a Christian something about the ultimate reality of the sacred, of God, and can give me a sharper appreciation of what my brothers and sisters in Judaism and Islam take a path parallel to mine, but not my path, but parallel to mine along the road as we struggle with the pilgrimages of our lives. So this will be a seminar, 10-week seminar, and every week we will take a couple of stories, at least 2 stories, maybe 3 stories from the 3 major traditions, and we won't so much compare them. That's too scholarly, and I don't think it's very helpful. But we will experience them. We'll talk about them. We'll go into the images. We'll go into our feeling response. We'll work with how we interpret these stories, how we might apply them to our own lives and our own work, and our own work with our religious community and also with the wider world. So we'll always keep in mind that we live in a Western world that is basically a secular, non-religious world, but we belong to communities of deep faith and communities of spiritual pilgrimage. So with that, I end. I invite you to come and join this adventure. We'll be meeting by Skype, no more than 7 people, so we can really spend time together once a week for up to an hour and explore these stories that we will have read and reflected upon in the week before. So I wish you peace, God's peace, shalom, salam, and pax. Again, I'm Bob Wilhelm. I'm a storyteller.